I'm Sarah, and I'm 28 years old. For most of my life, I believed my parents when they told me they simply couldn't afford to help with college. I accepted their explanation that $50,000 in tuition was just too much for a middle-class family to handle. I worked 3 jobs, took out crushing student loans, and graduated with debt that followed me for years. But when I discovered last month that my parents had just handed my older brother Jacob their entire life savings of $97,000 to help him start his 3rd failed business venture, something inside me finally clicked into place. All those years of being told money was tight, that I needed to be more practical, that my dreams were too expensive, suddenly every painful memory made perfect sense. Let me take you back to when I was 17, sitting at our kitchen table with college brochures spread out in front of me. I had worked so hard throughout high school. I was valedictorian, captain of the debate team, and had already been accepted to 3 universities with partial scholarships. My guidance counselor had helped me calculate that even with the scholarships, I would still need about $50,000 to cover the remaining tuition, room, and board for 4 years at my dream school. I remember the excitement in my voice as I showed my parents the acceptance letters, explaining how this particular university had the best program for my major and the strongest alumni network. My father barely looked up from his newspaper while my mother continued washing dishes. When I mentioned the financial need, my father's response was immediate and final. He explained that they simply didn't have that kind of money lying around, that they had their own retirement to think about, and that maybe I should consider the community college route for the first 2 years. What struck me even then was how different this conversation felt from the ones I had witnessed just 2 years earlier when Jacob was applying to colleges. I remembered my parents driving him to visit expensive private schools, taking brochures from the admissions offices, and talking excitedly about his potential. When Jacob's acceptance letters came in, there had been celebration dinners and proud phone calls to relatives. When he needed money for his first semester, there had been discussions about payment plans and financial strategies, never outright dismissals. But I pushed those observations aside. I told myself that family finances could change in 2 years, that maybe things had gotten tighter since Jacob started school. I convinced myself that my parents were just being practical, that they were teaching me valuable lessons about self-reliance and hard work. I buried my disappointment and threw myself into finding solutions. I spent the summer before my senior year working 60 hours a week at 2 different jobs, saving every penny for college applications and fees. I applied for dozens of scholarships, writing essay after essay about my goals and financial need. I researched every grant program available and filled out paperwork until my fingers cramped. When other kids my age were enjoying their last summer before college, I was stocking shelves at a grocery store from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then rushing to my second job at a local restaurant where I waited tables until closing. The pattern of differential treatment became impossible to ignore once I started paying attention. When Jacob needed a car for college, my parents co-signed a loan for a nearly new Honda Civic that cost them $18,000 in monthly payments they took on themselves. When I asked about transportation, my father offered to let me buy his old pickup truck for $2,000, a vehicle that broke down 3 times in my first semester and left me stranded on campus more nights than I can count. When Jacob's laptop died during his sophomore year, my parents immediately bought him a top-of-the-line MacBook Pro that cost over $2,000. When my ancient desktop computer finally gave out during my junior year of high school, I was told that laptops were luxuries and that I could use the computers at school or the library for any assignments that required technology. The Christmas gift disparities were particularly painful to witness. Jacob would receive expensive electronics, designer clothes, and gift cards that totaled several $100s each year. My gifts were practical. School supplies, generic clothing from discount stores, maybe a $20 gift card if it had been a good year. When relatives asked about the obvious difference, my parents would explain that Jacob was still in school and needed more support, or that I was more practical and appreciated useful gifts. But perhaps the most revealing pattern was how my achievements were received versus Jacob's struggles. When I graduated as valedictorian, my parents attended the ceremony, but there was no celebration dinner, no proud announcements to the extended family, no special recognition. It was treated as something that was simply expected of me, as if academic excellence was my basic obligation rather than an accomplishment worth celebrating. Meanwhile, when Jacob barely passed his classes each semester, my parents would reassure him that grades weren't everything, that he was creative and had other valuable qualities, that college was about more than just academic performance. When he failed 2 classes his junior year and needed to take summer courses to stay on track for graduation, my parents paid the additional tuition without complaint and praised him for taking responsibility to make things right. The summer before my senior year of college, I was working 2 jobs again to cover my living expenses and save money for graduate school applications. I had been accepted to several master's programs and was trying to figure out how to finance continuing my education. During one of my brief visits home, I overheard my parents on the phone with Jacob, who had just graduated and was living in their basement while he figured out his next steps. Jacob had an idea for starting an online business selling vintage clothing. He needed startup capital for inventory, a website, marketing, and basic business expenses. I listened from the hallway as my parents enthusiastically discussed liquidating some of their retirement funds to help him get started. They talked about it as an investment in his future, as giving him the foundation he needed to become successful and independent. The business failed within 8 months. Jacob had no experience in retail, no understanding of online marketing, and no realistic business plan. He burned through the money quickly, buying inventory that never sold and spending thousands on advertising that generated no real customers. When it became clear that the venture wasn't working, my parents reassured him that many successful entrepreneurs fail several times before finding their path, that this was all valuable learning experience. 6 months later, Jacob had another idea. He wanted to start a food truck, specializing in gourmet grilled cheese sandwiches. Again, my parents were supportive and encouraging. They helped him research permits and regulations, drove him to look at used trucks, and ultimately provided another $15,000 for equipment and initial expenses. This venture lasted slightly longer, almost a year, but ultimately failed for similar reasons. Jacob had the enthusiasm but lacked the business skills, work ethic, and realistic planning necessary for success. By this time, I had graduated from college and was working as a junior analyst at a financial services firm. Despite my crushing student loan debt, I was finally earning a decent salary and beginning to build some financial stability. I had moved to a different city for work and was only seeing my family during major holidays and occasional weekend visits. During one of these visits, about 2 years after Jacob's second business failure, I noticed that my parents seemed stressed about money in ways I hadn't seen before. They mentioned needing to postpone some home repairs, and my mother had started clipping coupons more aggressively than usual. When I asked if everything was okay financially, they explained that they were just being more careful with their spending as they got closer to retirement age. It was around this time that Jacob announced his third business idea. He wanted to start a landscaping company, claiming that his experience working part-time for a lawn care service during college had given him insights into how the industry could be improved. He had plans for specialized equipment, professional uniforms, and a sophisticated scheduling software system that would set him apart from competitors. What happened next still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. My parents, who had spent years telling me that $50,000 for my education was simply impossible, who had watched me work multiple jobs and accumulate massive debt, decided to give Jacob access to nearly $100,000 of their retirement savings to fund this latest venture. I learned about this decision not from my parents directly, but from Jacob himself during a family barbecue that summer. He was excitedly telling our extended family about his new business plans, casually mentioning that our parents had been generous enough to provide the startup capital he needed. When my uncle asked about the amount, Jacob mentioned that he had access to almost $100,000, which would allow him to buy professional equipment and support himself during the first year while building his client base. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I excused myself and went inside, needing a moment to process what I had just heard. The same parents who had told me that helping with college would jeopardize their retirement security had just handed their retirement savings to my brother for his third speculative business venture. That evening, after most of the family had left, I asked my parents privately about what Jacob had mentioned. I tried to keep my tone neutral, explaining that I was just curious about the business investment and wanting to understand their decision-making process. My father's response was immediate and defensive. He explained that this was different from college expenses because it was an investment that could potentially pay returns, that Jacob had finally found his calling and just needed the right opportunity to prove himself. When I pointed out that Jacob's previous 2 businesses had lost money, my mother jumped in to explain that those experiences had taught him valuable lessons, that he was more mature now and had learned from his mistakes. When I mentioned my own student loans and the financial struggles I had faced, my father's tone became irritated. He told me that I had turned out fine despite their inability to help with college, that I was successful and independent, and that Jacob needed more support because he was still finding his way. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful experiences of my adult life. When I tried to express how hurt I felt by the apparent double standard, my parents became increasingly defensive and dismissive. My mother told me that I had never needed as much help as Jacob, that I was naturally more responsible and capable of handling challenges on my own. My father suggested that I was being selfish and resentful, that I should be happy for my brother's opportunities rather than focusing on what I felt I had missed. But what really broke my heart was when my mother told me that they had always known I would be successful regardless of their help, while Jacob needed more support and encouragement to reach his potential. She meant it as a compliment, but what I heard was confirmation that my struggles and sacrifices had never really mattered to them, that my success was taken for granted while Jacob's failures were met with endless patience and financial backing. I left that conversation feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The people who were supposed to be my strongest advocates and supporters had essentially told me that my financial struggles were acceptable because I was strong enough to handle them, while my brother's comfort and opportunities were worth sacrificing their retirement security to ensure. Over the following weeks, I found myself re-examining every family interaction through this new lens of understanding. I remembered how, when I had called home stressed about juggling work and classes, my parents would give me practical advice about time management and remind me that hard work builds character. But when Jacob called with similar complaints, they would send him care packages and offer to pay for services like house cleaning or meal delivery to reduce his stress. I thought about all the times I had been told that asking for help was a sign that I wasn't ready for independence, while Jacob's requests for assistance were viewed as mature recognition of when professional support was needed. I remembered being told that my problems were learning opportunities, while Jacob's problems were obstacles that the family needed to help him overcome. The most crushing realization was understanding that my parents' treatment of me wasn't based on their financial limitations or principled beliefs about self-reliance. It was based on their assessment of who deserved support and who could be expected to manage without it. Jacob deserved investment, encouragement, and multiple chances to find success. I deserved to prove myself worthy through struggle and independent achievement. 3 months after that devastating conversation, Jacob's landscaping business was already showing signs of trouble. He had purchased expensive equipment but was struggling to find reliable employees and had seriously underestimated the physical demands of the work. His professional uniform sat unused in his closet while he showed up to jobs in whatever clothes were convenient. The sophisticated scheduling software remained unopened in its packaging because he couldn't figure out how to integrate it with his actual workflow. Meanwhile, my own career was flourishing in ways that surprised even me. The analytical skills I had developed through years of managing my own finances, combined with the work ethic I had built through necessity, had made me exceptionally good at my job. I was promoted twice in 18 months and was earning more than both my parents combined. I had paid off my student loans ahead of schedule and was building substantial savings for the first time in my adult life. But more importantly, I was beginning to understand my own worth in ways that had nothing to do with my family's assessment of me. Through therapy, I was learning to recognize the emotional manipulation and gaslighting that had characterized so many of our interactions. I was beginning to see that my parents' treatment of me wasn't a reflection of my value as a person, but rather a reflection of their own dysfunction and their inability to provide consistent, equitable support to their children. The final breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner that year. Jacob had officially closed his landscaping business after 8 months, having lost most of my parents' investment. Rather than acknowledging the pattern of poor decision-making and lack of business acumen, my family spent the meal discussing Jacob's next potential venture, a food delivery service that would compete with established companies like DoorDash and Uber Eats. When Jacob began outlining his funding needs for this fourth business attempt, I couldn't stay silent any longer. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, whether anyone else found it concerning that nearly $100,000 had been lost on 3 failed ventures, while I had been told that $50,000 for education was financially impossible. The response was immediate and harsh. My father accused me of being jealous and unsupportive, unable to celebrate my brother's entrepreneurial spirit. My mother told me that I was bringing negative energy to a family celebration and that my comments were hurtful and inappropriate. Jacob himself looked genuinely confused by my concerns, as if the connection between his repeated failures and my family's differential treatment had never occurred to him. But what happened next changed everything. My grandmother, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, finally spoke up. She told my parents that she had been watching this pattern for years and was ashamed of how they had treated me compared to Jacob. She pointed out that I had achieved more with no family support than Jacob had accomplished with massive financial backing and constant encouragement. She then revealed something that stunned everyone at the table. She had been setting aside money for years, intending to help with my graduate school expenses, because she recognized that my parents weren't providing me with the same opportunities they gave Jacob. She handed me an envelope containing information about an education fund she had established in my name, containing over $30,000. The room fell completely silent. My parents looked shocked and embarrassed, suddenly forced to confront their behavior through my grandmother's eyes. Jacob seemed to be processing the implications of what had just been revealed, and I sat there holding an envelope that represented more direct educational support than my parents had ever offered, given by someone who had been observing the family dynamics with clear eyes. My grandmother went on to explain that she had watched my parents repeatedly move financial goalposts, finding money for Jacob's wants while claiming poverty when it came to my needs. She had seen them celebrate his mediocrity while taking my excellence for granted. She had witnessed them excuse his failures while holding me to impossible standards of self-sufficiency. That evening, I had a long conversation with my grandmother about family patterns I had never noticed. She helped me understand that my parents' treatment of Jacob and me reflected their own insecurities and fears, not our actual worth or potential. She explained that some parents unconsciously favor the child they perceive as more vulnerable, while expecting the stronger child to manage independently. But she also made it clear that understanding these patterns didn't mean accepting them or allowing them to continue. She encouraged me to set clear boundaries about how I expected to be treated going forward, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The months that followed were challenging but ultimately liberating. I used my grandmother's gift to pursue a master's degree in financial planning, a decision that proved to be career-changing. But more importantly, I began establishing clear boundaries with my parents about our relationship moving forward. I stopped participating in family events where Jacob's failures were excused while my successes were minimized. I refused to engage in conversations where I was expected to provide emotional or financial support to family members who had never offered the same to me. I made it clear that any future relationship with my parents would need to be based on acknowledgement of their past treatment and genuine changes in their behavior. The response was initially defensive and dismissive. My parents accused me of being dramatic and unforgiving, of holding grudges and punishing the family for ancient history. They suggested that I was destroying family relationships over money, missing the point that this had never been about money but about fairness, respect, and equitable treatment. But over time, some genuine change began to emerge. My mother eventually acknowledged that they had treated Jacob and me differently, though she still struggled to fully understand the impact of that differential treatment. My father remained more defensive, but began making small efforts to show interest in my achievements and career progress. Jacob, surprisingly, became more aware of the family dynamics and began expressing appreciation for the support he had received. He stopped asking for funding for new business ventures and found steady employment in a field that matched his actual skills and interests. While we'll never have the close relationship that might have been possible under different circumstances, we've found a way to interact that acknowledges our different experiences without ongoing resentment. The most important change, though, was in my own understanding of my worth and my expectations for relationships. I learned to recognize patterns of manipulation and inequitable treatment, not just in family relationships, but in all areas of my life. I developed the confidence to advocate for myself and to walk away from situations where I wasn't treated with respect. My career flourished as I applied these boundary-setting skills in professional contexts. I negotiated salary increases with confidence, refused to accept unfair workload distributions, and built relationships with colleagues and supervisors based on mutual respect rather than my willingness to accept poor treatment. Today, I work as a senior financial planner specializing in helping young adults navigate family financial dynamics and build independence despite unsupportive family situations. I've discovered that my experience, while painful, gave me insights that help me connect with clients facing similar challenges. I understand the emotional complexity of financial family relationships in ways that textbook knowledge could never provide. I've also learned that healing doesn't require forgiveness or reconciliation on terms that aren't healthy for you. I maintain limited contact with my parents, engaging when they demonstrate genuine respect and stepping back when they revert to old patterns. I've built a chosen family of friends and mentors who celebrate my successes and support me during challenges, relationships based on mutual care rather than family obligation. The financial success I've achieved feels meaningful because it was earned through my own efforts and represents my actual capabilities rather than my family's assessment of my potential. I've been able to help other young people avoid some of the financial pitfalls I experienced, and I've found purpose in advocating for equitable treatment in families struggling with similar dynamics. Looking back, I can see that my parents' refusal to support my education, while devastating at the time, ultimately led me to develop skills and resilience that have served me throughout my career. But I also know that their willingness to repeatedly fund Jacob's failures while claiming my success was inevitable caused damage that took years of therapy and intentional healing to address. If you're watching this and recognizing similar patterns in your own family, I want you to know that your worth isn't determined by how your family treats you. The fact that you're strong enough to succeed without support doesn't mean you deserve to struggle alone. The fact that others receive help easily doesn't mean you're asking for too much when you seek the same consideration. Your family's assessment of who deserves investment and who should be self-sufficient says more about their limitations than about your value. You have the right to expect equitable treatment, to have your achievements celebrated, and to receive support during challenges. You don't have to accept a lifetime of differential treatment because it's easier for your family than examining their own behavior. Building boundaries with family members is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, but it's also one of the most important. You teach people how to treat you, and accepting poor treatment because someone is family doesn't protect the relationship. It just ensures that the relationship remains unhealthy. I want to hear from others who have experienced similar family dynamics. Have you noticed patterns of favoritism or differential treatment in your family? How did you handle discovering that family resources were available for some family members, but not others? What strategies have you found helpful for building boundaries while maintaining relationships that are important to you? Remember that your story matters, your struggles are valid, and your successes are meaningful regardless of whether your family recognizes them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is build the life you deserve, with or without the support you should have received. You're stronger than you know, and you deserve relationships that celebrate your worth rather than taking it for granted. If this story resonated with you, please share your own experiences in the comments. Let's build a community where people feel heard and supported, especially those who have had to create their own path despite family obstacles rather than because of family support.